Journey Together is almost here, and today we're going to be taking a look at over 40 different post-rotation deck lists for you to be able to jump straight into PTCG Live on day one. We've got City League winning lists, Omnipoke approved adaptations from our early testing sessions, and everything in between, so make sure you stick around to hear our thoughts on your favourite archetypes in the brand new meta. Let's get into it. Kicking things off then with some Omnipoke lists, we've got a brand new adaptation to Archaludon with Dudunsparce as the draw engine. Archaludon no longer has Radiant Greninja as a draw engine, so it has to adapt to something new, and since the deck already benefits from playing Artisan, Dudunsparce is a natural fit. Black Belt is still really important for us to deal with Dragapult, letting you take a hit and then use Relicanth to take a return KO using Raging Hammer on Duraludon, as well as making sure you can KO lots of basic EX Pokemon in the format right now with Archaludon's regular attack. The list isn't particularly flashy, but it tries to keep other archetypes honest by being one of the most consistent decks in the game with lots of 4-ofs. It's also a super easy archetype to play, so it's the perfect starting place for post-rotation testing if this is your first time playing the Pokemon TCG. Next up we have Charizard Terapagos, the new most popular way of playing Charizard. Most of the early successful lists of Charizard in Japan have converted over to the Noctowl engine instead of just running straight Pidgeot, and Noctowl helps piece together the powerful turns to utilise the classic combo of Dusknoir taking a prize that then boosts Charizard's damage output. The deck still plays Pidgeot, so between that and Noctowl, the deck feels quite a lot like the Terapagos Dusknoir combo deck that was very successful at times, and setting up stage 2s isn't too much of a hassle with dual seeking, picking up things like rare candy when you need it. The deck can play a multitude of different ace specs, but in this list we've chosen to go with Hero's Cape to avoid Dragapult bullying our low HP Pidgeys, whilst also preventing Ogerpon from one-shotting us in the brand new Terabox archetype. The next deck we're taking a look at is built around the brand new Lillie's Clefairy EX, which has an attack very similar to the old Raikou and Entei V. Its ability Fairy Zone means that you can take KOs on Dragapult really easily, and Dragapult looks to be one of the best decks in the post-rotation format, so having a good matchup into that is really important. This deck is like a simplified version of the Terabox decks, and it doesn't have as many attackers, but it does get to use Lillie's Pearl to force extra KOs out of the opponent. The deck also uses the brand new Volcanion EX to do an extra 20 damage by burning the opponent, meaning with Area 0, Clefairy can take KOs on basic EXs too. Onto Conkeldurr, a single prize stage 2 archetype that gets to take advantage of playing a really low energy count, meaning there's much more space to get this deck working compared to other stage 2 decks. It hits really good numbers for a single prizer, often being able to trade into the 2 prize archetypes really well, and being a non-rulebox Pokemon without an ability, it gets around all of the annoying wall decks too. Since the best cards in the Clorf deck rotate, this is kind of the new way of playing the Clorf style archetype. Having that annoying poison package backed up by a single prize Pokemon that does big damage in the late game is really cool, and definitely one to try out. On to some Dragapult lists then, and the first is going to be Dragapult Dusknoir. This is one of the best decks post-rotation as it loses very few cards from the final Sword and Shield sets, and this list has had to adapt to use Jacq instead of Lance, but that's one of the only changes you actually need to make to your current Dragapult lists. We don't have Radiant Alakazam anymore, but we do have Hawlucha to help us KO the 70 HP basics, which is really good, and this is another deck where we could play a variety of different ace specs. Crystal is definitely still a valid option for the fast versions, but Stamp in this list seems to be more successful from the early Japanese results. Next up we have Dragapult Charizard, an archetype that's actually started to pick up a lot of traction over here in the Western tournaments as well, and it's another build that's really successful that can adapt to the post-rotation meta without too many changes. This build naturally struggles a lot more with the walling archetypes, but it needs a lot less to compete with other big stage 2 decks just because of Charizard's great damage output in the late game. The attacks complement each other well against most decks. You've got the spreading angle from Dragapult, as well as the big damage in the late game from Charizard. So whilst it might be a bit worrying to try and get multiple stage 2s out, this archetype looks like it can compete with the other Dragapult variants too. And finally, for the Omnipoke Dragapult lists, we've got Dragapult Gholdengo, another cool Dragapult archetype that actually got second place in the recent Champions League. Dragapult can sometimes naturally struggle against some of the walling lists, but Gholdengo irons that out perfectly, because you then have a non-terra attacker and an attacker without an ability to get around most of the walls in the format. This Dragapult list also benefits from having a great draw engine in Gholdengo too, so between that and Drakloak you can really tear through your deck quite quickly. And similar to Charizard, Gholdengo can deal massive damage where Dragapult might normally fall short from a KO too. Onto an Eeveelutions based deck then. This is a deck built around either hitting weaknesses or just hitting great numbers with Flareon EX. The deck gets to abuse all of the different Terra cards such as Terra Orb, Glass Trumpet, Area 0, Briar, all of these good cards that came out towards the end of last year that really make the Terra Pokemon stand out. And the deck can theoretically attack from turn 1 for some explosive games throughout the gate through the use of Eevee's ability. This also has the benefit of using a lot of Eeveelutions that have just been given for free on the previous Battle Pass, so this is actually a really good budget option for new players too. Next up, we're on to Feraligatr. This is the Champion League winning deck from the most recent Champions League over in Japan. This deck has an incredibly unique playstyle. It has walling options, it has blocking options, it's got some hit and run, and it can do a huge amount of damage with Feraligatr's ability. And basically your opponent is just never going to know what to play around because there's so many different angles you could take with this archetype. The deck definitely did have a lot of surprise factor going into the Champions League, but I think it's still a great one to kick off your testing with because there'll be games you just get to steal from your opponent not being able to play around all of the different win conditions the deck has. Another potential budget option is Future Box. This is a deck that plays no cards from the brand new expansion, so you might already have all the cards you need to build this deck right now. And is hyper aggressive and really tries to bully some of the evolving archetypes by forcing Iron Hands in their face turn after turn from potentially as early as turn 2. Since we've had these cards for a while, like I say, you might already be able to build this, and it also has the benefit of being a really quick deck to play, which means you can grind a lot of games and start getting your way to Arceus tier, whilst also getting some brand new Journey Together packs from the Battle Pass. Next up, we have our first Gardevoir list. This is going to be the Omnipoke Gardevoir list, trying to build around the new N Zoroark as your draw engine. Zoroark is being used kind of as a curlier replacement. You can see we've got a much thinner Gardevoir line to make space for these Zoroarks. Obviously that takes up more space, but these Zoroarks do have much more HP, so they're much less fragile than the old curliers. And it also means you can have your draw engine online whilst also having Gardevoir set up as well. You don't have to pick between getting your Gardevoir into play or having an extra curlier in play. Lillie's Clefairy is a really, really good card for this deck as well. It means you can actually race Dragapult much quicker than you were able to before. Sometimes Dragapult was able to outrace you if they were able to get a turn 2 Phantom Dive, but Lillie's Clefairy really evens that matchup out. And of course, the deck still has access to a lot of tricks with the E-switches, with the Drifloons, with the Screamtails. So it's definitely going to be really interesting to see if this build is as successful as the previous builds when your draw engine was built into the deck. We'll be taking a look at 2 other Gardevoir lists later on, so stay tuned if you don't want to build around Zoroark and you want a budget option instead. Another deck that's trying to make use of the Dudunsparce engine is this brand new Gholdengo Dudunsparce list. The new Dudunsparce EX is a really good wall breaker to help you deal with some of the annoying wall archetypes that Gholdengo usually gets shut down against. And because in this list we're playing Dudunsparce anyway, it's just a 1-card inclusion and is a really cheap attacker too, which is nice. And the new Stadium Levincia is a really reliable way of being able to get back 100 damage every turn, just letting you put 2 lightning energy from your discard pile into your hand, which can sometimes ease the pressure of having to find an extra superior or anything like that, just to try and reach a knockout on a high HP Pokemon. Gholdengo looks really good in the new format, so this is definitely one I recommend you trying out, as it only has a handful of new cards, so it could be a cheap option to begin with too. On to some Hops Pokemon then, and we have Hops Spread. This is really similar to the Entei Valiant, but this is way more spread focused rather than trying to take active KOs that your Iron Valiants have set up for your Entei. And with all of the damage modifications, Zacian can actually 2-shot while setting up other KOs when you've got Postwick, you've got Snorlax, and you've got Hops Choice Band. Cram is a fantastic mid-game attacker, which can deal up to 210 damage theoretically for free, which is just crazy, as this can take out EX Pokemon like Ogerpon and Fezandipity just in one shot with a single prizer that you sometimes don't even need to attach an energy to. As you can see, we've got the Clefairy in this list too, because Dragapult naturally has so much HP, sometimes they try and wall you out with just having 320 HP and no weakness, and they won't put down lots of their small basics because they know you're going to knock them out with Zacian. We haven't had an amazing spread archetype for a while, but this one looks like it works quite well because Zacian doesn't need much to get going, so it gets to play things like Surfer as your supporter, because sometimes you need just an energy or just a tool to be able to start attacking. Next up, we have a brand new way of playing Raging Bolt. This is Bellibolt-Bolt. This is one of my favourite new decks to say. It's just got a great name. It uses Iono's Bellibolt to attach as many energy as you can from turn 2 to be able to Bellowing Thunder for huge amounts of damage, discarding Lightning energy instead of Grass energy through Ogerpon. This build is naturally less aggressive on turn 1 than the likes of the Ogerpon builds, but it has a much better draw engine, you're way less reliant on finding Sada every turn, and you can have multiple Killer Wattrel set up on your board to be able to discard and draw up to 6 after Ionos. You also have a really cool 1-prize attacking option in Voltorb that lets you trade up too, meaning that not all of the pressure is on Raging Bolt for you to be taking your knockouts, which sometimes caused issues for the Raging Bolt archetype where you were just feeding your opponent 2 prizes every turn. We'll be taking a look at another Bellibolt list later on that's just focused on Voltorb, but this is the more successful one in Japan so far, so we wanted to build this one first at Omnipoke. Another brand new Pokemon is Mamoswine. This is a Mamoswine Pidgeot build, a brand new Stage 2 Pokemon that has huge HP and the potential to deal a lot of damage based on how many Stage 2 Pokemon you have on your board. This build uses Garganacl to accelerate energy and has Pidgeot to smooth everything over, and the deck really feels like once you set up one Mamoswine, you really are able to chain the next Stage 2s together quite easily. Mamoswine can have a huge range of partners. We've seen lots of different archetypes do well over in the City League so far, and we're going to take a look at another list later on built around Blaziken EX instead of Garganacl, paired with Mamoswine. Here's the big one then, Zoroark. This is probably the most hyped new archetype, and I think probably the archetype we've tested the most so far, because of course Zoroark has the trade ability, which everyone is really excited to see once again. Trade lets you discard a card from your hand to draw 2, and it really makes the deck incredibly consistent at pulling together these combos. The deck isn't overly flashy and doesn't try to do the same things as the old Zoroark lists did, but just having that natural consistency means it looks like it's going to be a really good contender going into the new format. Zoroark copies N's Pokemon's attacks, and in this list, we play 2, we play Darmanitan, and we play Reshiram. Darmanitan is very much like Greninja and bullies low HP basics, and can actually be used as an attacker as well with that reversal energy we play. And then you've got Reshiram to deal with higher HP threats that have damaged Zoroark in the first place, as well as just a consistent 170 damage to deal with like single prize Pokemon that Darmanitan can't usually knock out. We also have that Petulant combo, the Petulant Binding Mochi, to help us get into 210 with Reshiram's regular attack. So you can actually take KOs on some 2-prize Pokemon as well, which is really good. I'm really interested to hear if this is going to be one of the first decks you guys play. This is definitely high on my list to test out, and I'm really excited to see how people end up building this archetype, given how diverse we've seen Zoroark be in the past. Onto some Raging Bolt then, and Raging Bolt also adopts the Noctowl engine in order to stay as one of the best aggressive decks in the format. Noctowl being able to guarantee you things like Sada, Iono, Boss, all on those key turns is really good, considering basically finding your supporter is always the most important thing to do as the Raging Bolt archetype. The baby Raging Bolt can help as a really cool 1-prize attacker that KOs low HP basics, so you don't have to spend huge amounts of energy just to get these KOs. And whilst we don't have Bench Barrier in the format, it's actually a really nice 1-prize option. And it's another deck with no new cards, so all of those people that have been playing Raging Bolt this whole time, it's a great option to start your early ladder grinding. Considering the deck looks really good going into post-rotation, I think it's one of the best aggressive decks out there right now. Next up we have Slowking, a fun, rogue, new 1-prize archetype that uses Slowking to copy some very strong attacks, like Kyurem, like Conkeldurr, essentially being able to use all of these attacks for just 2 energy. The Xatu in the list helps you set up Slowkings turn after turn after a KO, and the Academy at Night stacks the Pokemon you want to the top, and then things like Lana's Aid and the Max Rod A-Spec recover them, so you can use them over and over again and you're able to chain some really powerful attacks. We've seen how Regidrago was able to abuse Kyurem turn after turn, and sometimes win the game in 2 turns just by using 2 Kyurem attacks, and Slowking can do exactly the same thing, and on a 1-prizer too. Onto Terabox. This is one of the most talked about archetypes so far post-rotation, primarily because of the success of Tord and a variety of other Japanese players playing it in the latest Champions League. Of course, a few of them making very deep runs with the deck as well, and naturally any deck that Tord picks up, people tend to flock towards too. The deck plays similar to the likes of Lost Box, where you've got a variety of different attackers and you need to choose the right one on the right turn for the right matchup. But it can do some really, really powerful stuff with Crispin and Crystal, because you can sometimes get a Wellspring Ogerpon KO on turn 1, knocking out 2 of your opponent's Pokemon. You've also got attackers like Lillie's Clefairy, Pikachu, and Teal Mask Ogerpon, again all for those specific matchups and specific points in the game. I really think this is one of the most rewarding decks to play right now. If you can learn it early, you're very likely to do very well in the early tournaments. And I think this is definitely one I would recommend everybody tries out, just because it's so much fun to play. It's really complicated, but it feels really rewarding when you manage to weave together a really impactful turn. And finally then, in terms of some Omnipoke lists, we're taking a look at Wallstall. This is an adaptation from the controlling decks pre-rotation. They sort of adapt into walling decks in post-rotation since we lose a lot of the controlling tools. We've got Milotic for the Terra Pokemon, we've got Farigiraf for other basics, we've got Cornerstone for Pokemon with abilities, and that means there's basically not many Pokemon that aren't covered by one of these 3 walls in the format right now. The deck has even been able to play Pokevital A, an A-Spec that I think no one ever thought would see play. And you also have Monkey Dory to be able to move the damage off and actually be able to take KOs much quicker than other walling decks normally would be able to. I think this is how a lot of Control and Stall players are going to adapt initially, whilst we're still working out exactly how to build Control in this new format. So I expect to see a lot of it in early ladder grinding, so making sure your decks have an answer to these walling archetypes is going to be really important in the first few days, I think. On to some successful City League lists then, and the first one we're going to be kicking things off with is Aegislash. This is another walling archetype that saw some success in the early stages of the City Leagues, before this wall stall archetype really became popular. It's kind of a more traditional walling deck where we're just walling multi-prizers with single prizes, and then we're trying to take KOs on the single prize Pokemon that our opponent would be using to get around the walling abilities. We've also got the EX in here as a late game sweeper, so you're not overly reliant on using the baby Aegislash over and over again. You actually have an option, a late game attacker that can do some big damage towards the end of the game. Next up, we have a pretty simple Ancient Box build. This is a complete single prize version of the deck. We are going to be talking about Roaring Moon a little bit later on, but this is a much more traditional single prize Ancient Box style list. You've got big damage for multi-prizes, you've got huge HP for the single prize decks, and you've got the Dudunsparce engine to continually draw through your deck throughout the game to try and find Sada every turn, similar to the other ancient decks out there. This is another one you could jump straight onto the ladder with no new cards needed for the deck, so it could be a really good option if you've played some ancient box in the past. Next up we have Azumarill. This is a classic one prize deck that we don't see too much of. You now get to play Clefairy for the Dragapult matchup, which is one of the harder matchups traditionally because they're able to take multiple prizes against you across a couple of turns. And we have Black Belt and Conkeldurr, which means you can try and take a KO on a lot of other EXs with Azumarill for just one energy if we have a Terra Pokemon in play. Cornerstone is our Terra of choice just to try and cover some of the other matchups. Things like Charizard where we don't normally one-shot. And again, it can just be really annoying for certain archetypes that don't have a great way around the ability. On to the first of 3 Ceruledge lists then, and the first we're going to be taking a look at is Ceruledge Revavroom. The Revavroom draw engine hasn't been too successful, but pairs really well with Ceruledge because you want to be discarding energy turn after turn to be able to reach huge damage with Ceruledge's attack. We've still got Budju in here for the early game, and Conkeldurr helps us deal additional damage to reach stage 2 KOs that normally Ceruledge wouldn't be able to get to until the real late game. And this list gets to play a few more nuanced supporters that other lists might not normally be able to do if they're just trying to discard their hand every turn with things like Research, Squawkabilly, Carmine, all of those more traditional turbo supporters that we have. Next up we have Ceruledge Zoroark. This is a much more simple build and tries to just discard as many cards every turn with Zoroark, getting those energy into the bin for Ceruledge's attack. Now, realistically, with these Ceruledge lists, you could kind of pick your favourite bits out of each of these and try and take the best bits from both, but you can see things like Conkeldurr in both the lists here. And Zoroark having much higher HP means it's way less liable to being KO'd, and also you don't need specific cards post-Iono to try and draw back into your combos. You don't need an energy like Revavroom does, you don't need to find something like a Dudunsparce, you just have the draw on the board and you can discard any card you want in the hand. The final Ceruledge list we'll talk about is like a turbo Ceruledge style build that's very much just focused on researching and carmining every turn and aims to do one thing and one thing only, deal huge damage with Ceruledge's attack. The list is as simple as possible to try and hit as hard as possible, as consistently as possible, but we do play things like Pokemon Catcher to try and be able to gust whilst using research, similar to how other aggressive archetypes like Raging Bolt have used Catcher in the past. On to Dragapult Iron Thorns then. This is still potentially a popular archetype just because Thorns stops so many abilities still in the format right now. This City League list here has also adopted the Conkeldurr package. You can see that so many decks right now are playing Conkeldurr. It's just such a strong card. It really helps increase your damage output and obviously naturally really pairs well with Dragapult's spread attack. As was always the way with the archetype, there's no real draw engine. It just plays a high supporter count and tries to draw into a supporter every turn naturally, with things like Poker Gear backing that up too. The second City League Dragapult list we're going to take a look at very quickly is Dragapult Xatu. This is a much slower Dragapult build that has seen some success in City Leagues, but I think this is probably the weakest one on the list we've got right now. The deck does have additional draw power once you evolve out of your Dracloaks, as well as being able to set up a Dragapult in one turn without having to use your Crystal. And because of that, you get to play the Unfair Stamp, which is obviously just really, really powerful. And as I've previously mentioned, Conkeldurr naturally fits into Dragapult decks if you can find the space to help replace Radiant Alakazam and really try and apply some pressure with the spreading angle of Dragapult's attack. Next up, we have something quite hot off the press. We have Espathra Xatu. Espathra has started to see quite a lot of success recently to counter a lot of the basic toolbox decks. It's of course got really good typing against Zoroark and Charizard, two decks that have been quite popular in the post-rotation format so far. And then you've got the Lillie's Clefairy in here to help against Dragapult, so you're actually hitting a lot of good decks for weakness right now. And just in general, Espathra's ability is pretty annoying to deal with if you're not hitting for weakness anyway. We also have a Froslass build here that uses Espathra, that tries to take advantage of all of the Noctowl engines we have right now, spreading damage onto the Noctowls, and trying to take multiple out across a couple of turns with multiple Frostlasses on the board. The brand new Maractus from Journey Together can try and trap something in the active, similar to how Tempting Trap used to do it, and it also has an ability that damages the Pokemon that KOs it, meaning you get some extra counters to play with on the board once your opponent does take the KO. As mentioned, we've got the Espathra in here that can help us get through Pokemon that have way too much HP, but also can just be used as an efficient attacker to slow the opponent down while you're also spreading damage onto their board. Next up, we have Festival Lead. This is another fan favorite one prize archetype. I feel like we always see people trying to build around this card. Of course, one of the biggest issues with this archetype was Dragapult, and Dragapult is everywhere right now, so it's a bit of a risky one to try out. Rabsca is definitely super important for this archetype. You have to get it online from turn 2, just so Dragapult doesn't run you over. But the fact we have Black Belt means that we actually can reach into one-shot KO range on some EXs right now. And it's really easy for us to take a KO across 2 attacks, and we can always find the pieces when we need them because of Thwackey. I don't think this is going to be rocking the world, but if you are a fan of Festival Lead, here is a successful City League list for you. As mentioned, we're going to take a look at another Gardevoir list. This is Gardevoir Dudunsparce. We're actually going to be taking a look at 2 Dudunsparce builds, and this first one is going to be built around recycling Enriching energy as your draw engine over and over again. Eventually the deck can try and get low enough in cards where you can cycle this turn after turn if you can draw into it turn after turn. You do of course lose access to some of the more powerful ace specs in the format, but without Curlier the deck really needs a good draw engine, and the Dudunsparce Enriching energy combo is quite fun to play around with. We've got the Clefairy in here for Dragapult of course, and we've got Mew in here that can copy other Pokemon's attacks, just as an alternative attacker. It's seen success in Gardevoir in the past, and I think it's a really good time to try it out again. This second, slightly more standard Dudunsparce build instead uses Brilliant Blender as a way to discard plenty of Psychic Energy now that we don't have Curlier to do it for us. If you can draw into it early, it helps thin the deck early on, which is great, as Gardevoir, the only place you ever want your energy cards, pretty much is in the bin. So having a reliable way to do this is going to be really important. I think you can very much mix and match these lists in terms of their attackers. I just wanted to make sure we showed off a couple of different builds around Dudunsparce to show that there are multiple ace specs and ways you can build Gardevoir going forward, showing that the deck may not be out of life after all. Taking a look next at this Hops deck. This Hops deck is built around the complete Hop package. It's got the Cramorant, it's got the Snorlax, it's even got the Dubwool. Dubwool has a fantastic ability letting you gust something up from the bench, meaning that you don't have to spend your supporter for the turn doing so. This build is still very much focused on the spread element of Zacian, but because you're not running the Valiants and all the switching cards, you do have a lot more space for some other tricks in your build. Things like the Monkey Dory means that you can try and take multiple KOs in a turn with Zacian's spread, as well as being able to fit in that aforementioned Dubwool line, which is really good. Secret Box kind of brings this whole thing together, as there's some great tools and a really good stadium that we always want to have access to throughout the game, so having a card that can search out some of these more difficult to find cards is really, really useful. On to another fun one then, we've got Hydrapple. This is a rogue archetype that hasn't really been too successful so far, but with a smaller card pool, this could be a lot of fun. Of course, similar to Festival League, you're still really scared of Dragapult, but arguably I could see you trying to weave in a Clefairy and a couple of Psychic Energy into the build if you're super concerned about this. You've got the one prize angle with Diplin, you can slow down other decks with Budju, and eventually Hydrapple can be dealing huge amounts of damage, and since you have that healing angle from Hydrapple's ability, you're actually pretty tanky too. We talked earlier on about the Iono's Pokemon, and if you wanted to try out the Iono's package without playing Raging Bolt, here's a list that is just focused purely on Lightning Energy. There's multiple Voltorbs, so you can trade up into 2 prizes, but honestly early on, Bellibolt is a pretty solid attacker, deals a consistent 230 damage, which knocks out the majority of basic EX Pokemon right now. I still really think Kilowattrel is one of the best draw engines we have too, since you can pre-attach the energy before your opponent Ionos you, so you don't need to draw into anything following the Iono to start building your hand back up. I'm pretty sure the Raging Bolt list will be more successful, but if you wanted to try this dedicated Ionos build, I'm really interested to hear how it goes down in the comments. Next up we have a deck that I'm really excited to try out. This is Magmortar Budju. If you liked the Poison Budju lock decks, this is like a burn style version of that. You've got the new Volcanion EX in here to burn the opponent, with Magmortar sitting on the bench to increase the damage of your burns turn after turn, and with just a couple of Magmortar, the deck ends up doing quite a lot of damage in between turns, whilst also item locking your opponent. And of course we've got the judges, we've got the hammers, we've got the fans to disrupt the opponent too, whilst you're item locking them. I don't think I'm going to make many friends by playing this archetype, but if you've been a fan of the Poison Budju decks of the past, I think this is a cool adaptation, using a special condition that we don't really see too much of. Next up, as mentioned, we've got another Mamoswine build. This is the Blaziken build that I mentioned earlier on. This one uses Grand Tree to help try and get that first stage 2 into play. Like I said earlier, once you've got one, you can start to chain them together much easier. And Blaziken helps out by giving the deck another weakness it can cover, which means we don't just get run over by the grass attackers like Teal Mask Ogerpon, that's popping up in all sorts of decks right now. We've nearly got to the end of the list and we haven't even talked about Miraidon yet. This Miraidon build right here is heavily focused on generators and Iron Hands. I still think throwing an Iron Hands at your opponent on turn 1 is one of the scariest things you can do. If that first Iron Hands can take 4 prizes, you're sometimes at such a colossal lead, you just need one more attack to be able to win the game later on. Of course, we still have options of taking a big KO with things like Pikachu or Ursaluna, so once you've started chaining your Iron Hands, you should find it easy to close out the game. It's so important that we get back-to-back Iron Hands against Evolution decks. We play the Academy at night, we play Cypher Maniacs, we try and stack Lightnings to the top in the late game, so that once we've burnt through a lot of our energy, our late game generators are still as powerful as our early ones, because we're guaranteeing the hits from them. However, if you're looking for a Miraidon deck that's a little bit different, you can try out this brand new Pikachu Miraidon build that really focuses on using Pikachu turn after turn as an attacker. We've got Joltik and Magneton as well as Crystal and Crispin to help Pikachu set up quickly. You'd also see we've got the Galvantula in the list. This is a really cool one prize attacker that's great for dealing with Charizard and Zoroark. since it's dealing 180 for just 2 energy on a single prize Pokemon against anything with an ability, which when you take into account for weakness, knocks out Charizard and Zoroark in one hit. We've also got things like Defiance Band and Gravity Mountain to help with other stage 2s that you don't have weakness on, and that Picnic Basket in the list stops our opponents from spreading damage onto our board before trying to knock out our Pikachus on the following turn in one hit. Up next, we have a new style of Archaludon that's recently seen success in Japan. This was actually a deck that Joe was considering for the most recent Stockholm Regionals for a little while, but definitely looks much better in the post-rotation format compared to pre-rotation. The deck plays the Poison package to be able to deal 280 against Pokemon Archaludon would normally struggle to KO, and because of the Petarant package, you're also able to donk some Pokemon, particularly some of the evolution decks, between that and Perilous Jungle, which kind of replaces the Radiant Sneasler we used to play. Think of it as kind of like the Poison package, with a reliable tanky late game when the Poison isn't doing enough against some of these bigger EX Pokemon anymore. Roaring Moon loses a lot from the rotation, but similar to Archaludon, it can adopt the Poison package to try and help alleviate some of those issues. You've still very much got that turbo element to try and take quick single prize KOs with Petarant, but you've got the big blow up potential from Roaring Moon. You can still set this up in a turn with Sada plus Energy Switch. We don't have Dark Patch anymore, but there is still ways of being able to power up a Roaring Moon in one turn. And of course, once we have set it up, Roaring Moon is able to KO whatever's in its face with the Frenzied Gouging attack. And finally then, we have a Zacian Archaludon list. This list aims to use both of Zacian's attacks, rather than just trying to use the spread attack that we've seen in Zacian lists so far. This works really well with Archaludon, because Zacian naturally has more damage modifications, and has a better base damage, so where Archaludon would sometimes fall short, Zacian can often just take a one-hit KO. The deck still uses Archaludon a lot, but you have the Hops package to fall back on, knowing that you can get this big one-shot attack at some point during the game, most likely. This also uses some of the earliest cards you get on the Battle Pass, so if you've been playing Archaludon quite a lot recently, you could very easily adapt your Archaludon deck to be able to start playing with this build from day one. And that's it. 43 lists for you to try out on day one of Journey Together. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know down below which lists you'll be trying out first. And if there's anything you didn't see in the video that you're excited to play, I want to hear it all in the comments. We'll be live from day one over on Twitch and here on YouTube for some post-rotation streams. So make sure you come and say hi and hear our thoughts on the early rotation meta. See you guys tomorrow for Journey Together.